want to extend a very warm welcome and thank you to each of you for taking the time to be with us today. My name is Joan Thompson. Our goal as the North American Climate Justice Team with the Community of Christ is to help all of us to become better educated about the science and all of the complexities of the current environmental and climate crisis this world is experiencing, and also to empower each of us towards action that promotes justice for all of creation. We're thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Robert McLeman. He's a professor of geography and environmental studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. A former diplomat, Dr. McLeman is an influential scholar and researcher of how climate change affects the migration and displacement, of people in North America and around the world. He's served as a consultant on environmental migration for government agencies both in Europe and North America, for the World Bank, the OECD, and multiple UN organizations. He's also served as coordinating lead author for the IPCC, that's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Working Group 2's sixth assessment report, leading an international team of scientists in assessing the impacts of climate change on human health, well-being, migration, and conflict. His book, Climate and Human Migration, Past Experience, Future Challenges, has been the primary textbook for undergraduate and graduate teaching on the topic for almost a decade. Following his presentation, we'll have some time for questions. At any time, go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Now, by default, what you put in the chat will go to everyone. But if you can change that to send it only to Dean White, that will help the rest of us by minimizing the pop-up windows while we're focusing on the presentation. So Robert, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll turn it over to you now.
Well, great, and thanks so much, Joan, for having me. And thanks to all of you for giving up part of your Sunday to join us here. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm going to start a slideshow in just a moment, and when I do, I'll ask maybe Dean just to say in my ear if you can see it okay. So let me try sharing the screen. And let's try getting the slideshow going.
I can see it.
Good. And can you see the next one as well? Can you see me toggling back and forth?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks, Dean. Yeah, so thank you everyone for allowing me to join you this Sunday. If it sounds like I'm slurring my words, I apologize. I have not been into the communion wine, but I did have some dental work done last week. So I'm learning to talk again. But anyhow, what I plan to do is talk for about 30 or 40 minutes at most about some of the key things that, anybody would want to know about how climate and how the environment more generally affects migration and displacement patterns around the world, what we are doing to the climate, and why we should care. I get the feeling that I might be preaching to the choir here, so to speak, which is great, and I'm very pleased to be speaking to people of faith who are very much interested in the state of creation and our space within it. So anyhow, let me start by showing you this picture. I don't know if there's many teenagers on today's call, but I suspect most of you know who this person is, Greta Thunberg. Certainly my daughter, who's a teenager, knows precisely who she is, and most teenagers do. She was arrested this past week. I took this image from Teen Vogue magazine, which is a sign of the times. When I was a teenager back in the 1980s, I don't think Vogue followed the world's environmental issues, but I suppose Greta Thunberg is a celebrity beyond celebrities these days. And so the issue we're talking about today is of critical importance to young people. It's of critical importance to everybody, regardless of age, but it's especially critical to younger people who are inheriting an increasingly climate disrupted world. And they are pushing back. And I think that one of the things that we can do as people who are much older than Greta Thunberg is to help. One of the things that I really dislike hearing people my age or older say is that, well, we made a mess. The younger generation, they'll fix it. They'll do better than us. And my retort is always, as long as you're breathing and on the right side of the grass, you should be helping and not leaving it to younger folks to try and solve. Anyhow, just to give you a little image that was taken, this photograph was, I'm in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. This is our town square. This was a few Septembers ago, a climate justice protest that was taking place in our town square. And you can see that young folks really do feel strongly about this, but so does the general public, I think, increasingly. And one of the things, and the reason why I'm speaking to you today, is that people are increasingly concerned that if we stay on the pathway that we're on right now, more and more people are going to be living in crisis-like situations, living in refugee-like situations, because the very basics of what we need to survive as people, fresh water, a suitable climate, suitable temperatures, our food systems, in some places, the very ground that we live on may be threatened. And we are already starting to see the thin edge of the wedge. We're starting to see growing numbers of people in all different parts of the world, including North America, Canada, and the United States, living in places where climate change is making it increasingly difficult to inhabit those places. And just a few little screen grabs that you see here on your screen. The one on the lower left-hand side, the black one there that says about 3 million Americans are already climate migrants. That's a CBS News story from about 4 or 5 months ago. So historically, we've tended to think of this as a problem that affects other people in other parts of the world, but increasingly we're starting to recognize that it's affecting us here as well. And so let me go back to sort of just a couple slides about the real basics of climate science. Now, some of you may be well versed in this, others less so, but let's start from the beginning. There are gases in the atmosphere that trap heat in the close to the Earth's surface. And this is not a new science. This is a very old science. It dates back to the 1850s. And the slide you see on your screen here, this is an image of a device made by a British engineer named John Tyndall, which he used to measure the heat trapping properties of different types of gases. So even by the 1850s, the technology was good enough that he could separate different types of gases, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and so on. He would put them in that horizontal tube that you see there in the middle of his device. And then he would use a simple sensor to see whether or not heat could pass through the tube and get to the other side. And if it could not, then obviously the heat's being trapped in the tube. And so we know for a fact that water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and certain chemicals that humans make, such as chlorofluorocarbons, trap heat. So in other words, the sun is shining on the Earth. It warms up the Earth as the heat is trying to leave the Earth's surface. It is prevented from immediately leaving the atmosphere. It eventually gets out of the atmosphere, but it's delayed by these trace gases in the atmosphere. So it's not a particularly new science, but what we are able to do today is that with satellite technology and a variety of other technologies, we can measure very specifically how much carbon dioxide and other heat trapping gases are in the atmosphere, but we can also go back in time. And so what I'm showing you here on my screen right now is a slide prepared by NASA. And the yellow line that you see is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the slide on the right-hand side, that's the present day. And then if you go to the left-hand side of the screen, it's going back hundreds of thousands of years. Now, you may be wondering, Well, how do we know how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere 100,000 years ago or 500,000 years ago or so forth? And what scientists do is essentially they take ice cores in Antarctica, in Greenland. So these are hollow core drills, and they just drill down through the ice pack. And so on Greenland, there's a kilometer or more of ice, and that ice has been laid down as snow, where it gets compressed and turns to ice over hundreds of thousands of years. And so as you drill down from the surface, we go farther back in time. And there are little bubbles of air that are trapped in that ice. So as we go down hundreds of thousands of years with that hollow core, as long as we keep it frozen, we've got air from hundreds of thousands of years ago. And then scientists can go in and extract that air and measure its components. So what you see here is a reconstruction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You can see it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. And of course, over those hundreds of thousands of years, we have had ice ages, and we have had periods between ice ages, which is where we are right now. We call those interglacials. So when there is an ice age, and ice ages are not caused by people, they're caused by natural variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun and the Earth's spin and it's on its axis, and so on. So when these ice ages occur, obviously the Earth gets temporarily colder, but what also happens is that there's less vegetation, right? Because obviously the ice is crowding out plants. Plants, as we know, photosynthesize, and they pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? So when there's fewer plants on the planet, carbon dioxide levels start to rise in the atmosphere. And then as the ice age starts to retreat, as the ice sheets retreat toward the poles, we have more plants, and those plants start pulling carbon dioxide again out of the atmosphere, right? And so they're taking out of the air and locking it into their tissues. So we see this gentle oscillation over time between the ice ages and the interglacials. But obviously it does not take a trained scientist to recognize that something weird has been happening over the last 100 years or so, right? We're growing exponentially in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is something we can measure right now. And we know why there's all this extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's us, right? We did it, and we are doing it. And the key ways in which we cause carbon dioxide levels to go up is by burning fossil fuels. So, gasoline, oil, natural gas, these are fuels. Well, gasoline's a refined fuel, but you know what I mean? Oil and coal and natural gas are in the ground. They're essentially fossilized trees and vegetation from millions of years ago. It's locked in the ground. We pull it out. We burn it, we release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And that's been happening on an increasing scale since the early 1800s, and it's growing exponentially right now. Well, not quite exponentially, but exceedingly fast, our burning of fossil fuels. The other thing we do is obviously we use cement. The industrial process that makes cement releases carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Steel making is another industrial process that releases carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And then we are also busily cutting down the Earth's forests. And so we have shrunk the size of the Earth's forests over the last couple thousand years by 40 or 50%. The fewer trees there are on the planet, the less carbon dioxide that is being taken out of the air around us and locked into the tissues of vegetation. So collectively, through these three processes, we are causing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere to soar to levels that have never, probably I shouldn't say never, perhaps millions of years ago, long before people were on the planet, perhaps there were carbon dioxide levels that high in the atmosphere. But essentially, not since there have been people on the planet have carbon dioxide levels been the way they are today. And we see this, right? We can see this in the temperatures that we are experiencing right now. So the chart you see on your slide, on your screen here, goes back to 1880, and it was prepared by the National Oceans and Atmospheric Agency of the United States. So this is the NASA counterpart for environmental science. And so what this chart shows is this, is that if we go back as far as the 1880s, we have good thermometer-based records for daily temperatures for large areas of the planet. As we go back earlier in time than the 1880s, the geographical coverage of our weather record starts to erode. So scientists tend to start in the late 1800s, which is also when the Industrial Revolution really starts to ramp up. And what they've done is they've taken the average global temperature between 1880 and 2023. That's the horizontal line in the middle. That's the average. And then what they do is each year the average temperature is compared to the mean for the entire period. So as you can see, the blue lines are periods when we have years where the average temperature is cooler than the mean, and the red ones are years when the global average temperature is higher than the mean. And what you can see is that apart from a short period in the 1930s, late 30s, early 40s, folks will remember the Great Depression, the dirty 30s, the Dust Bowl year, and so on, a little bit warmer than average in that era. But what we can generally see is that starting in about the 1970s, 1980s, every year, year after year, it just keeps getting hotter on the planet, and much hotter than the average for that 145-year time period. And the last year is on the very right, that is 2023. And as you can see, 2023 was literally way beyond anything that's been seen in the last 140 years or so. And I think if you're in the United States, you can probably remember that Canada exported to you a lot of wildfire smoke last summer, which was a direct consequence of those extreme temperatures that you see in 2023. So this is not random. This is something that is a direct cause and effect kind of phenomena. We know that the cause is carbon dioxide levels are growing and they're trapping heat in the atmosphere. And we know who's putting the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's us. And so what we're seeing right now is on the left-hand side there, that's a photograph of a fire near the city of Kelowna in British Columbia, not too far north of the US border, and you can see the fire burning very close to the city. Last year we saw these massive, massive forest fires right across Canada. This past winter, North American winter, there were very large fires in the southern hemisphere as well. That's a natural consequence of hotter, drier weather is we get longer fire seasons. In Western Canada and parts of the Great Plains, there's been a drought for the last few years. Again, that's just a natural occurrence. When we have hotter than average temperatures, we run the risk of droughts. And then extreme storm events as well. We've seen some really bad storms in recent years. I think in the southern US, just this past week, there were some nasty tornadoes that blew through. And again, a little bit early in the year to be having storms like that, although it can happen. But the point being is that when we add more heat to the atmosphere, we start to mess around with precipitation patterns. We start to mess around with the frequency and severity of storm events. And that's just the short term, right? That's stuff we're seeing right now. All of these things get more common, more frequent, more severe if we don't change the path we're on. And then we've got additional longer term impacts as well. There are parts of the world where already summertime temperatures are getting to the point where it is physically unsafe to be out of doors because it is so hot. And if we continue on the path we're on, there will be large regions, especially in Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Southern Europe, where summertime temperatures will be dangerous for human health. They will be so hot. The nighttime temperatures will be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summertime. So there will be no relief, essentially. And we can imagine the health impacts that will have. And of course, also, sea levels are rising. And there's two reasons for this. One is, as it gets warmer, ice and snow on Antarctica and on Greenland and in the high mountains starts to melt and it drains eventually into the ocean. The other thing is that as ocean temperatures get warmer, as water gets warmer, its volume expands. I don't know if any of you did this in high school science, where you get a Bunsen burner of water and you apply heat to it and you watch the volume of the water increases as it warms up. What's happening is we're adding all this extra heat to the air. The air is in contact with the ocean. It transfers some of that heat to the ocean. The ocean surface starts to warm up. As it warms up, it literally starts to expand. And so through this combination of increased meltwater going into the oceans and the expansion of the surface layer, sea levels are rising. Now, they're not rising by a lot in the larger scheme of things, only by about 3.5 millimeters per year. So about what, a 1/16 of an inch, maybe, an 1/8 of an inch per year it's going up. Doesn't sound like much, right? But that's year after year after year. It accumulates. And if you live in the San Francisco Bay Area or in Chesapeake Bay or in, the coast of Florida or the coast of Louisiana and Mississippi, it adds up, and there's going to be problems by the second half of this century. By the 2050s or beyond, those sea levels, as they expand, are going to threaten those coastal cities, and not just in the United States, but around the world. So that's the longer term path that we're on. And so this gets into the part of where we get into why I'm here speaking to you, which is the human consequences of this. The image you see here is of a community called Tuktoyaktuk in Canada's Northwest Territories. And as you can see in the background, there's the village, there's the ocean. There is no more than a meter or two between the houses, the base of the houses, and the sea in front of them. And I've been working in a small way with this community in Tuktoyaktuk. They're primarily Inuit people, Indigenous people. By the year 2040 or 2050, they're going to have to move. They can't stay where they are. So they're going to have to move quite a few miles inland at the very least to be safe. Because reality is what you see there is a nice calm day where the sea is frozen. But in the summertime, when there's no ice on the sea and there's storms or winds or high waves or high tide, that water gets pushed into the village on a regular basis. And so for the folks who live here, this is not an academic question. This is not a philosophical question. It's not a spiritual question. It's a practical question. Where are they going to go? Because their homes that they live in now are worthless. They're of no value anymore because you can't live in them for a long time, and they're going to have to move. And it's not just the folks in Tuktoyaktuk. There's places like Kivalina and Shishmaref and Newtok and Barrow in Alaska where it's the same thing, is that these folks have been living on the sea, on the coast for a while now, but now they have to move. Where they live is no longer viable. And that's really just the thin edge of the wedge. There are other parts of the world as well where it is becoming increasingly difficult to live. And this is causing indirectly implications for Canada, the US, and other countries. The image I'm showing you here is of Canadian peacekeepers in a country called Mali, which is in West Africa. And Mali has been literally suffering from droughts and extreme heat for the better part of 2 decades now. They have some respite from time to time, but it is a very conflict-prone and often war-torn country in West Africa, desperately poor. The folks are so poor. And what's happening is that it's not that climate change is causing the conflict. The conflict already exists. The problem is that it exacerbates things. It makes things worse. The people can't grow any crops. Food prices are beyond the means of the people who live there. And so for Canada, it may be a drought that is causing displacements and violence in another part of the world, but we're there trying to keep the peace. And so this is one reason why I think that it's important that we have these conversations, not just in the context of what's going on in Canada or the United States, but what's going on around the world, and how as global citizens, we end up having to intervene, sometimes by peacekeeping, sometimes by aid assistance, sometimes through financial mechanisms. But we cannot pretend that when these things happen in other parts of the world, that there are no consequences for us. I've been doing this kind of work for going on 2 decades. And there's one group of people year after year who have never doubted the science, who have never questioned what's going on about climate change, but have always wanted to know, what will the implications be? What are we going to do about it? And that's the US security establishment, the US military, they don't question the science. They understand the consequences, right? They understand that when there's drought in another part of the world, it has an implication potentially for the US military. It affects their operational capacity, but also the US military, let's face it, gets drawn into a lot of places around the world. The senior generals, regardless of who's the president of the United States, never question the science on this, regardless of who's the president. So the only reason I bring this up is, again, trying to set a global context that the world is changing rapidly, the climate is changing rapidly, and it is having direct consequences for people all around the world. This graph that you see here, one's a little inset of the other one. What it shows is the average number of people around the world who are displaced each year by weather or climate-related disasters, primarily floods and storms, but also wildfires, as we saw here last year in North America, and in some places, drought, extreme temperatures, and so on. So if you look at the graph on the left side of your screen first, you can see on the y-axis, the scale is millions of people displaced. And then the bars are organized by continents. And as you can see, the bulk of people displaced each year from their homes by floods and storms are in Asia. Countries like China, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Pakistan. And that's the average, right? About 18 million people each year in Asia are displaced from their homes by weather-related disasters. Africa, the next continent, and then in North America. And you can see in North America, the red bar, that's wildfires. We have an ongoing problem, as you know, in North America with people being displaced by wildfires. The little inset map on the right-hand side shows other parts of the world as well. That's measured. We have data for that going back to 2010. But what I want to show you is 2022. We don't have data yet for 2023. 2023's data will be released in May, and it's gathered by an organization based in Geneva called the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And so I don't know how well it'll show up on your screen, but you should see in the upper left-hand corner a map, and in the lower right-hand corner, data by different types of weather disasters. And what happened in 2022 was that nearly 32 million people around the world were displaced from their homes by weather-related disasters, primarily floods and storms, but also droughts and wildfires. And everywhere on the map, you see big circles. The bigger the circle, the more people displaced from their homes by weather disasters. So Pakistan, Philippines, China, India, Nigeria, big numbers of people displaced from their homes. Although you see there's a fairly big circle in the United States as well. Back in 2022, California had some bad wildfires. There were some extreme storm events in the Caribbean and other localized weather events that displaced people as well. Point being is that the average is going up. I guess I should show it that way. Is that it seems that with each passing year, more and more people are being displaced from their homes by extreme weather. And although the 2023 statistics are not out yet, I suspect they're going to be high again. So a little bit more data for you. This is data from the World Bank. And what they did was they did a forecast trying to look out to the year 2050. Now, 2050 is not that far off in the future. I hope to see 2050. I hope many of you do as well. My kid will certainly see 2050. In fact, she'll be my age in 2050. And so this is not some way off over the horizon projection. It is within the lifetime of young people today. And what they project, the World Bank, is that if we continue on the course we're on, in low-income countries around the world, they expect over 200 million people will be displaced from their homes by climate change-related weather disasters. That's an awful lot of people. That's 5 times the population of Canada, to give it some context. And again, this is not Greenpeace. This is not some radical environmental organization. This is the World Bank's projections, right? These are small c conservative folks who are saying if we don't change our ways, that's what's going to happen. However, and that's the good part, is that they say if we do change our ways, we can avoid 80% or more of that kind of chaos, for lack of a better word. In fact, I think they're being too conservative. I think that if we do what we need to do, we could reduce it to close to zero. There's no reason, quite frankly, why we should have so many people being displaced from their homes by weather events right now, let alone in the year 2050. And so this begs the question, what can we do? And what kind of future can we expect? Well, there are three things. If you ask me today, how many people do I think will be displaced from their homes by climate change in coming years? I will say I can't give you a straight answer because there are three key uncertainties about the future. So uncertainty number one, are we going to do something about climate change? Are we going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? Because if we do, we can avoid a lot of the chaos that the World Bank has forecasted. Now, on your screen is a chart, and I know there's a lot going on, and I apologize. There's a lot of information in it. But essentially what we have on the vertical axis is global greenhouse gases per year. And the black line that starts over on the left-hand side and says historical, that has been greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. And as you can see, it's been going up. All the colors refer to different pathways we can take. There is something called the Paris Climate Agreement that most countries around the world signed. I don't know if North Korea signed it. They're kind of crazy anyhow. But the United States and Canada and China and India and Russia and so on all signed it. And if we were to actually follow through on that, the planet's still going to get warmer. It's unfortunately, that's just the reality. What we've pledged to do will not avoid a warmer future. The planet will probably warm up to about 2 to 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was back in the late 1800s. To give you some context, right now, it's about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer today than it was 150 years ago, on average around the world. In Fahrenheit, that's what, about 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit, I think. Probably, maybe not quite, 1.1. I'm trying to do this in my head. Probably about 2.5 to 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Anyhow, the point being is that we have promised to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not moving quickly, and our promises made right now are not enough. And why this is critical is that for every 0.5 degree Celsius warmer the planet gets, we increase the risk of people being displaced from their homes by anywhere up to 50%. Each 0.5 degree to degree we go up. So between the number of people who will lose their homes and lose their livelihoods in coming years and coming decades and our commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists talk about 1.5 degrees Celsius. Essentially, scientists have been warning for the last 20 or 30 years to anyone who will listen that we cannot allow the planet to get more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was 150 years ago. And the reason is that that's when we start to lock in a lot of these catastrophic changes. More wildfires, more droughts, more floods, more storms, rapid sea level rise. As we go above 1.5 degrees Celsius, those things, we start to lock those into our climate system. But if we can push those down, if we can push our greenhouse gas emissions down and get them down close to zero by the year 2050, we can avoid that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. So there's a lot of work to do to get there. Means essentially eliminating carbon-based fuels from our economy over the next 30 to 40 years. But if we can do that, we can avoid a lot of chaos that we are currently on path to lock in. I want to show you a simpler graph to read. And what this shows is greenhouse gas emissions since the 1850s. And what we can see, the top line is global emissions. And as you can see, especially starting after World War II, there's tremendous growth globally in greenhouse gas emissions. And then the other lines are The purple line right under is high-income countries. And what we can see that high-income countries like Canada and the United States, our emissions have been growing, but they've started to taper off. And a lot of that is because of Europe reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, but also the United States. A lot of progress has been made in America in the last couple decades in weaning the energy system off coal. And so America's greenhouse gas emissions are no longer growing rapidly the way they did up until the 1980s or 1990s. They've started to level off. It'd be great if we could get them to go back down. Canada's emissions keep going up. And part of the problem is we sell a lot of oil and gas to the United States. And so our emissions is going up, but also our consumption up here in Canada. Our greenhouse gas consumption is huge. But one of the things that people will point out, and quite rightly, is that if we look at the gap between the top line and the next line, that's all emissions from lower income countries, countries like China, India, Pakistan, you name it, lots of low and middle income countries. Their emissions are growing rapidly. And so that is a challenge for the world, is to get those emissions down as well. And we can come back to that as well. But one of the realities is this, is that the next slide shows you per capita greenhouse gas emissions. So if you take a country's emissions and divide it by the number of people who live there, you get per capita or per person emissions. And so this map, the darker the color of your country on the map, the greater the individual residents' emissions. So what you can see here is that Canada, Australia, Saudi Arabia, we have on a per person basis the highest greenhouse gas emissions of anybody on the planet. United States is sort of in the next tier. You're not far behind us. We're ahead of you up here in Canada on that one. The lighter the color, the lower the per capita greenhouse gas emissions. So poorer countries, typically in Africa and Asia, they tend to have the lowest per person emissions. Wealthier countries have the highest. China, India, somewhere in the middle. So when we talk about who's going to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, politicians in Canada and the United States like to say, well, look at China. Look how big their emissions are. And that's true. Their emissions are quite large. But then again, there are 1 billion people in China, right? 1,000 times a million people in China. In Canada, there's only 40 million people, right? So yes, on an aggregate or total amount of emissions, Canada's emissions are tiny compared to China. But again, there's 1,000 million people in China. And when we divide their emissions by the number of people, what we see is the average person in China is responsible for a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions that the average Canadian is. So the question becomes, when we talk about who shall lead, who will go first and make the serious commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, fairness would say those who are individually the greatest contributors to the problem should be among those who go first. Second question, and I'm getting close to the end of my canned presentation, so we can open this up soon for questions. There's something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which were developed back in the 1990s and have been updated since then. And these are 17 goals to essentially make the world's poorest people less poor and to bring low-income countries up to the same living standards as middle and high-income countries, right? And these are things that everybody can agree on, right? Things like ending poverty, ending hunger, ensuring that all kids get to go to school, whether they're girls or boys, whether they're rich or poor, making sure that everybody has access to clean water and proper sanitation. These are like the basic needs. Will we achieve these? And one of the realities is that right now, there's a lot of countries around the world where these goals are still well out of sight. We are not achieving these goals. We have children by the millions dying of easily preventable diseases. We have children by the millions who are not going to school. We have children by the millions who are going to bed hungry every day. There is no way on this planet that those folks are ever going to be able to cope with or adapt to climate change if they're going to bed hungry, if they're going to bed drinking contaminated water, if they don't have access to basic education, basic health care. So one of the ways we can help poorer countries avoid climate chaos is to make them less poor, quite frankly. so that they're better able to cope with these disasters. The reality is that, when there's a climate disaster of wildfires or storms in North America, people are temporarily displaced from their homes, but governments step in, help them rebuild. Insurance companies may be there to help them compensate them for their losses and so on. If you live in Niger, if you live in Mali, if you live in East Timor, nobody's going to step in to help you if you live in a poor country. So by making those countries less poor and have higher income standards, higher living standards like us, they are better able to cope with the risks associated with climate change. And then the final thing is, are we going to embrace migrants? Are we going to care for people who are displaced from their homes by climate change and environmental disasters? Because the reality is this: there are tens of millions of refugees around the world right now, and we do a very poor job looking after them, and they live in the most desperate of situations. And climate change is going to create tens of millions more, perhaps hundreds of millions more. So the question becomes, are we, as North Americans, going to continue to allow this to happen on our watch, essentially, as political leaders like to say? Are we going to allow suffering to continue? One of the reasons why we have so many people trying desperately to migrate to Canada and the United States is because their homelands are desperately poor and often racked by violence, by political instability, by climate hazards. So as long as we allow those countries to remain poor, to remain undeveloped, those folks will have no choice but to try and make their ways to our countries. So I guess the point is, are we going to help migrants, or are we going to try to keep them out and keep them desperate? Because let's face it, folks are going to move. Well, they are moving, right? It's desperate what they're doing right now to try and get to Canada and the United States. It's only going to get more desperate, not less desperate for them in coming years. So what are we going to do about migration more broadly? So this is where I wrap up. And again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. Anybody who's giving up their Sunday afternoon to listen to this is probably already an open-minded, compassionate, caring individual. But there's a to-do list of what we can do as individuals to make a difference and to get us moving on the right pathway. And that's the word I like to use, is that we're not going to solve the climate crisis or the migration crisis, refugee crisis overnight. But we do need to get onto a better pathway than we're on right now. So how do we get onto that better pathway? Well, one is to reduce our fossil fuel consumption, right? Because that's at the heart of all of this chaos that we're sowing for ourselves in coming decades. So every little incremental step that each individual one of us can do to reduce our fossil fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, that's a step in the right direction. Second thing, and again, I am definitely preaching to the choir on this one, is to participate in the social life of our communities. It is very well proven that climate action is really just a tiny subset of larger social comings together of people who are like-minded and compassionate and caring, and who start by caring about their own community where they live, and like an onion, they grow out in layers. And so participating in the social life of our communities, not just on climate change, but just on the little things that we can do to make our own communities better, that gets us on the right pathway. Another one is to spend more time in nature. As I was waiting for the call to start, or for the today's meeting to start, I heard some people chatting about going hiking in the Pacific Northwest, and that's a good thing. And we need to spend more time in nature. We means all of us, our kids, ourselves, because, and this is not my line, this is from a famous environmentalist named David Suzuki, is that it's very difficult to be empathetic and compassionate about something you have no experience of, right? So if we're not out there experiencing nature on a regular basis, how can we be empathetic and compassionate about what we are doing to nature if we spend more and more time indoors, right? So we need to get out there. We need to use social media to make positive change happen. Social media can be a cesspool. It can be a a pit of despair, but it can also be used to make positive change as well. So for those of you who are on social media, use it to spread the word, spread the gospel in religious terms, but also the gospel about caring for the creation, caring for the environment, caring for the planet. And this is something that I suspect most of you vote, but I really emphasize to young people in particular when I'm talking to them, I'm a university professor and so on, is that we have to vote, right? If we don't vote, we're giving up our say in the way things are done or not done. And so vote. But obviously, I would discourage anybody for voting for politicians who refuse to act positively in terms of protecting the planet and dealing with the climate crisis. And most important, and again, this is where folks on this call already understand this from scripture, is that we need to be compassionate. And that's one of the things that I fear, having done this type of research for 20 years now, and been on the planet for over 50 years now, is that public discourse in all fields is losing its compassion for other people. We need to get that back. The folks who made so much positive social change in the 1960s and 70s, right? When you think about voting rights and civil rights and women's rights and indigenous rights and the launch of environmental organizations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and so on, we need to get that back in a hurry. Anyhow, I think I have talked way too long now, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just say thank you for hanging out with me and bearing with me. And I am happy to take questions. I guess, Dean, you're going to moderate the question and answer session. Is that right?
I am, and I have a few already posted. First of all, just clarifying some of the statistics and definitions. What is there a minimum number of days that organizations use to calculate whether a person has been displaced? I guess particularly related to the climate-related challenges. In other words, some people, have to be gone for a few days because of a fire in their own home or whatever. How do they do that counting?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so there is a standard protocol that it's called the IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, uses. And so it needs to be a certain number of people. So I think the threshold is at least is it 100 or 50? So it's not just like an individual house burning down, but it needs to be more of a community. And it can be temporary, or it could be indefinite. And so they actually keep two numbers. One is the number of new displacements each year. So that's the number I showed you, which is how many people are newly displaced in that given year. And they keep them not only for weather events, but also for conflicts. And then at the end of the year, they do an inventory of how many people are still displaced at the end of the year. And then they sort of keep a running tab year after year. So the number of new displacements is typically higher than the number of people displaced at the end of the year, but both figures are going in the wrong direction, unfortunately. But that's a great question. And the other thing is it's only internal. So if somebody flees across a border because of it, they don't actually count that person. So there are cases like, for example, in Bangladesh, where there may be flooding, people will go to India to stay with relatives or so on. Those folks don't get counted. The other thing is it only counts displacement, which means you leave your home against your will. Because you have to, right? But it does not count people who look around and say, this place is just too desperate. I cannot live here anymore. I need to move. Those folks don't get counted. So they're considered voluntary migrants, even though, if you look around and you can't get a crop out of the ground for the 5th year running, and you don't have enough money to send your kids to school, and you move, okay, technically you're not displaced. But you've still had to move. So the numbers are gray. I agree. They're fuzzy, but at least they're numbers, right? So we have an idea of the scale of things. So it's not trivial. It is in the tens of millions. And in fact, we're at the point now where the number of people who are displaced for weather-related reasons is actually higher, or has been higher, than conflict in recent years. Now that may change now because of obviously Gaza and Sudan and Ukraine, but in the last decade or so, the number of weather-related displacements has actually been higher than conflict. So that's, again, another worrying trend.
So displacement can be both within and across international borders.
Absolutely, yeah. But of course, if you go across international borders, then it's the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, who keeps tabs on you. Now, if you have to flee across a border for environmental reasons, you're technically not a refugee, and so you are not legally entitled to protection by the UN. However, they will still kind of keep tabs on you, keep numbers and so on, because their mandate is to look after refugees from conflicts and not people who are fleeing environmental disasters.
Well, and there was a question also about that distinction
Mhm.
in terms of, policies, for example, in the United States, where refugees of that sort aren't granted the same opportunity for seeking residency or even citizenship as are those who are fleeing, for asylum reasons. Do you
Mhm.
anticipate that there is any kind of a groundswell of effort to change and expand that definition of what's a refugee?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, the way the United States has tended to deal with these situations is something called temporary protected status, or TPS. And so, for example, when there's a hurricane in Central America and there's a little pulse of extra migrants coming into the US from countries like Honduras or El Salvador, or indeed if there are people from those countries who are temporarily in the United States and can't go home, then they get temporary protected status, but they do not get an automatic pathway to applying for permanent residence. That's the way America has tended to deal with it. Um, the shorter answer is no, I don't think there is a global groundswell to expand the definition of what constitutes a refugee. There may be some folks, especially in the humanitarian organizations, humanitarian sector, who are dealing with these folks on a regular basis, who might want to expand the definition. But there's no interest on the part of countries like Canada, the United States, European countries, or so on, to expand the definition. Because the reality is that we already have lots of refugees in the world who meet the existing definition that we are unable to provide proper care for. So do we really want to expand the number of people entitled to that protection? The other thing is, if you actually meet folks from countries that are on the front lines of climate change. I'll give you an example. A few years back, I was helping the German government organize a conference that had leaders of small island states from the Pacific. These are low-lying atoll nations where there's no land more than a meter or two above sea level. Places like Tahiti and the Marshall Islands and Kiribati and Tuvalu and Vanuatu, very small coral islands in the Pacific. And their leaders said, no, we don't want to be considered refugees. We don't want refugee protection. We don't want refugee status, even if we have to leave our islands. And the reason, they said, is because we have seen how you in the West treat refugees, and we don't want any part of that. What they do say is, however, we would like to be able to migrate with dignity. And what that means in their definition is that we would like the ability for our young people to be able to move to countries like Australia, the United States, New Zealand, and our young people can go to your countries, study, get work permits, learn your language, learn your customs, get job skills. They'll remit money back home, and we'll use it to build seawalls and do whatever it takes to try and stay on our islands. But if the day comes when we can no longer live on our islands, we won't be refugees. We will be highly desirable, skilled workers that any country would welcome as migrants. That's what they tell us they would like to see. So that was a wonderful question, Dean. That idea of a refugee, both the receiving countries and the potential sending countries are very hesitant about using that label.
In some prior conversations, we've tended to use the term pilgrim as a way of perhaps removing some of the pejorative connotation around migration and refugee status. Because in our history, of course, we were all pilgrims, those of us who are descended from colonial folks, to a better opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
The let me just quickly look here. In terms of the sustainability goals that you mentioned, I guess a couple of questions. To what extent do those I mean, the word sustainable implies that they are to be pursued within planetary limits. And so it's the whole challenge of, how does growth and sort of the imperative toward growth in our economies interact with those sustainable development goals?
Wonderful question again. Just I wanted to add one more point on refugees. Is that actually before World War II, the term refugee was not such a loaded term. It was used just colloquially by governments, in just the ordinary sense of things. If you look at U.S. government reports from the 1930s, the Dust Bowl era, John Steinbeck, the Grapes of Wrath, the migrants coming from Oklahoma and the southern Great Plains to California, government reports just called them refugees. So they would have, monthly refugee statistics in California, and they were referring to other Americans. But yeah, the term has become loaded. Coming back to the question you just asked me, what is sustainability? Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, in one sense, the way that North Americans live right now is not sustainable, right? We know that we are drawing down the world's resources at an incredible rate. Just look around our cities, right? We can see folks living homeless on the streets. But in cities where there are mansions and where there is opportunity galore for certain groups of people and not others, right? So social sustainability, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, we have our challenge here in North America as well. But in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, the countries that are farthest from achieving those goals are the most desperate and poorest parts of the world, where the water's not drinkable, where millions of people are not getting 3 square meals a day, where kids are not going to school. Those are all within the limits of the planet, right? Raising those folks from desperate poverty to a simple status where their kids go to school, they avoid easily preventable diseases and so on. That's within the limits of the planet. So I guess what I'm coming back to in sustainability is that folks like us on the call, we need to be pushing down our environmental footprint, and we need to be helping other folks actually increase their environmental footprint in a way. We want folks in countries like Mali, in Nicaragua, we want them to be, in one sense, using more energy, building economic growth, building wealth, because they're so poor right now. We want to get them up. At the same time, what we want to do is achieve sustainable prosperity in our own countries, which is to build wealth, to have a healthy society, to have a happy society, and do so in a way that we use less energy and less resources, which is all technologically feasible now. But yeah, we need this convergence towards, as you mentioned, so like a planetary level that we can meet everybody's needs without drawing down the wealth of the planet and then just the sheer beauty of the planet as well.
Do you have thoughts on how agricultural production at the commercial level can be accomplished in a way that also fits within sustainability goals? I mean, there's the famous Borlaug revolution that expanded, the volume of grains produced per acre. But again, we seem to be reaching kind of a limit on that. Do you have any notion of how that might be reconciled with our need to stay within sustainable limits?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And food is a good example of where we often get locked into these sort of dogmatic approaches to looking at things, whether it's, eating organic versus, GMOs and so on. One thing is that coming back to what you just described is that the amount of food that American farmers can produce today is borderline miraculous. I've traveled along the Great Plains many times over. Farmers in Kansas can grow so much corn in one season, there's literally nowhere to put it. I don't know if you've ever driven across the plains, but if you pass a railhead where there's a depot for farmers to drop off their corn, their grain, whatever they're producing, that the silos can't hold it. There's so much of it. So they literally just pile it on the ground. There's these giant mountains of corn by the railroad tracks, and it takes 9 to 10 months to ship out all the corn that was produced last year, and they get it out just in time for the next year's harvest to come in. And that is genuinely miraculous. It is truly impressive. So technologically, we are going, by leaps and bounds. We've improved yields on North American farms, and it has been happening in other parts of the world as well. Not quite as quickly as it is in North America, but it's still growing quickly. But it comes at some environmental cost, doesn't it? We use a lot of pesticides, a lot of herbicides, a lot of fossil fuels to produce those huge volumes of food. And a lot of that food does not actually go directly into the food system. It's corn that's not being grown for human consumption, but going into livestock feed and growing cattle, which are in turn raised on feedlots increasingly. I don't know if you've seen a big confinement animal operation on the Great Plains, but there might be 10,000 or 50,000 cattle standing in their own urine and feces being fattened up on corn before they go to a slaughterhouse to be turned into $3.99 value meals, right? That system is not really sustainable over the long term. That said, though, we could grow all kinds of food in sustainable ways if that was the way our system was set up, right? And so in one sense, the reason farmers grow so much corn and so many cattle under those systems is because people want $3.99 value meals. So maybe there's a cultural shift that needs to happen as well. But coming back to the bigger picture, which is that until fairly recently, increases in global food production have been able to keep pace with human population growth. But just in the last decade or so, we've sort of reached a threshold where each year on average globally, we produce more and more food, but there's so many people to feed that the per capita food availability around the world has started to level off. So right now, on an average year, there is enough food around the world that in principle, we could feed everybody. But we've got distribution problems. We have North Americans who are eating, quite frankly, way too much food, so much so that we have diabetes problems, and we're using Ozempic to try and lose weight and things like that. And we've got other parts of the world where people are going hungry and not eating 3 square meals a day. So we've got enough food globally, but it's not getting onto the dinner plates of everybody fairly. So we've got some food distribution challenges. I'm making this answer much longer than it needs to be. One final thing is that technology is still good in the food system. And I've had students who, for example, fly drones over apple orchards using sensors to find out which apple trees are most likely to get sick in a given growing season, right? And then the farmer can go out and rather than blasting the whole orchard with herbicides or pesticides or what have you, they can target individual trees and so on. So that's the way we can use technology to continue to enhance our yields, but not in a way where we're causing great harm to the planet. Apologies for the really long answer, but it's a question that really intrigues me and I love to talk about.
I'm scanning through the questions that we've gotten here.
And I did see a hand up at one point, although it went down. I don't know if the person put their question in the chat or not.
Mary had a question.
Go ahead.
Mary Colburn.
Oh, I did. I wanted to piggyback on that, what he was saying about the food system. I live in Michigan, in Southwest Michigan, and we recognize, those of us who are really committed to sustainable food, that we are second to none, and maybe even, second to California, but maybe even second to none in diversity of crop production. And yet, what we see in our county are the big farmers buying up the small farms, bulldozing the farmhouses as if housing wasn't a crisis, right? And planting corn or soybeans from the edge of the road all the way, where there used to be barns and houses. And none of it, the majority of the farmland in the county is going for things that aren't food. And it's because there's such massive subsidies. And we had Debbie Stabenow in our county, and she's head of the ag committee, but she still struggles to get any shifts, any changes. And so we subsidize these monster carbon emission. I mean, we do, and it's the reality of our food system at this point in time. They're trying to make shifts, and that's why this election's really important, because this administration's putting a lot of money into, even though people don't know it, into the food systems and underserved communities, and so there's a ton of money out there to access, if people can figure out how to access it and pull together. But we definitely subsidize the wrong things. So anyway, that's just what I wanted to share.
No, I think that's a wonderful comment. I mean, one of the realities is a lot of folks don't know where their food comes from. There was this poll that was done in the UK not so long ago where 11% of people who responded did not realize that bacon came from pigs. They thought it grew like a plant. And it's amusing, but at the same time, it's kind of indicative of the fact that a lot of us don't know, and some of us don't care either, but a lot of us don't know how our food is made and what the implications are of the system that produces it. And all we care about is how much we pay for food at the end of the day, which I get, especially when inflation is high. It's important. And your point is well-being, and I think there's an onus on those of us who do understand the food system better to share that information with others. One of the things I talk about is the carbon footprint of food. There's far more energy needed to produce 1 calorie of beef than to produce 1 calorie of any plant-based protein, legumes, tofu, you name it, right? So some environmentalists will tell us we all need to be vegans. That would be nice. It's a tough sell for a lot of folks, though, right? And food is a cultural thing as well as a, biological thing as well. So I don't tell people to be vegans, especially if they're not already inclined to that. But what I do say is this, is that if you genuinely care about climate change and you care about the carbon footprint of your food, 1 day a week, don't eat any meat. Just eat plants that day. Go for pasta for supper and, hummus and crackers or whatever for lunch and so on. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but actually if you do that faithfully every week, once a week, you've just reduced your carbon footprint associated with food by 1/7, which is, if everybody did that, okay, we've got a 1/7 reduction in greenhouse gases from a sector of the economy that produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And it won't put any of our farmers or ranchers out of business if we do that. And maybe, just maybe, it will stimulate a little bit of sustainability in that sector of the food system. I don't know. And if you can go to 2 days a week or 3 days a week, then 2/7, 3/7. Once you hit 4 days a week, now you're over 50%, right? So my wife and I, what we do is we still like the odd burger once in a while. We still like the odd steak or piece of chicken, but we commit just ourselves 3 or 4 days a week. We don't eat meat, and that's the way we manage that. And it's not judgmental either, is it? More meatless days, the better. Yeah, I have been for certain periods of my life vegan, like no meat for extended periods, months or years on end. It's not easy, right? And especially in our food culture, Wendy's doesn't have a whole lot of options for vegans, right? So anyhow, great question though, Mary. I really appreciate that part of the conversation.
In your research and study and educating of folks around these issues of migration and the climate, how do you bring, and you've already mentioned, concern for the poor and how we mitigate the effects of poverty in countries that are suffering from those situations, but how do you bring justice into the conversation when you are studying or lecturing or researching on this topic of migration?
That's a wonderful question. And in one sense, it is a question of human rights and justice, isn't it? The reality is that most folks don't want to migrate. Most folks like to live where they now live. That's where their families are. That's where their friends are. That's where their economic prospects are. That's where, they speak the language, they understand the culture. Most folks don't want to migrate, regardless of where they are in the world. Young folks tend to like to migrate more than others. They like to go out and see the world, but that's a little bit different, isn't it? That's opportunity seeking, that's cultural and so on. But most folks don't want to move. And so that's the first thing we need to get out of the way with migration, is that we need to stop thinking of migration. And I even used the word myself mistakenly earlier as a problem. Migration is not a problem. Migration is an opportunity when it is done well, and when it's done in a way that people can move legally and have access to labor markets and social safety nets and so on in the places that they move to. The reality is the way we've got our global system set up now. If you're a computer programmer or if you're a wealthy entrepreneur, you can move and live wherever you want in the world. You can just float around through life and settle wherever you like a dragonfly on the wing, right? But if you're a truck driver, or a receptionist at an office, you can't go wherever you want, right? The system is set up to try and keep you in your place, whether you want to move or not, and you often get trapped in situations that you would like to get out of, right? So the way I bring up the justice idea when I talk is that my wife is an immigrant. She wasn't born in Canada. She was born in Ireland. And my mom is an immigrant. She was born in Scotland. So I'm biased. I'm pro-immigration, 100%, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for immigration, right? And so I think all of us, if we think about our own family histories, there is migration in there, whether it's moving from Michigan to New Jersey to go to school, whether it's moving from halfway around the world to start a business in Los Angeles, right? We all have these histories. I think, Dean, you mentioned it. If you're not an Indigenous person, there's migration in your history here in North America, right? So we have to stop thinking about it as a problem, and we need to stop thinking about it as something that affects and involves other people, right? We're all involved. And then the question becomes, I guess, for people of faith, right? I mean, this is an easy one. Use the word pilgrim, Dean. We live in an increasingly faithless society, and I think that makes it easier for people to turn a blind eye to what's going on in terms of what's happening to migrants all around the world and even in our own countries, right? So, again, if we don't want people to be forced to flee their homes because of floods, droughts, storms, and so on, then you and I need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. That's the way we solve the problem, right? It's like going to the doctor. The doctor can prescribe you Tylenol, but that's not going to solve the problem, right? And so at the root of this is again, lack of progress on greenhouse gas emissions, lack of progress on making poor countries and poor people less poor, and turning a blind eye to the plight of people who are in those situations.
The pattern of migration, as you know, I think you've mentioned, in North America tends to be folks moving up from Central and South America for a variety of reasons, and into North America, the U.S. and Canada. Similarly, Europe looks at migration out of Africa and Asia, perhaps. What can communities in North America do to be more welcoming? And by that, I mean sort of economically welcoming and welcoming from the standpoint of creating a more hospitable situation for migrants to move into locales that have less stress due to climate. And that could be a question really relating to both international migration north, as well as internal migration within the United States, for example.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I love to read the New York Times. I get it delivered to my house, and I'm a subscriber. So I was reading today's New York Times, and there's a story in it. I don't know if anybody knows New York, but there's an area called the Hamptons where all the wealthy folks have their homes. And there's a story in today's New York Times about Guatemalan men who live in the woods in tents. And they're the ones who do the yard work and do the maintenance on all these multi-million-dollar mansions in the Hamptons. And so during the day, they're being entrusted to come onto the properties of wealthy people and do whatever work needs to be done. And then at night, they go back to their tarps in the woods where they spend the night and sleep. And it's almost heartbreaking to hear these stories, right? Because these folks want to work. They are working. It's not that they want to work. They are working, right? They want to contribute to our communities, and we don't give them pathways to regularize their status in the United States and Canada. And once they are regularized, if they ever get to be regularized, it takes forever for them to get their families to come up to join them. And they are just, they just live in this netherworld. And we need to make more legal pathways for people who come to become regular, documented workers, give them pathways to permanent residence, to citizenship. I think here in Canada, historically, we've been, and I don't want to be too judgmental, but I think we've been a little better at it than the United States. We have a lot more regular pathways for people to work temporarily in Canada, whether it's, as farm labor, as household domestic workers. There's many more ways that people can get a work permit. And be here legally. And that's important because when you have a work permit, then if you get sick, you can go to the doctor. If you injure yourself on the job, you've got protection. If your employer tries to cheat you, you can, if you're documented, you can go to the authorities and seek some sort of justice, right? But when people live in that netherworld of undocumented status, they don't have those luxuries. And then because the reality is this, we need their work. Canada's population, if it weren't for immigration, our population would be declining, much as it is in Italy and France and other parts of Europe. We're not having babies anymore here in Canada. The average woman has 1 to 2 kids. That's not enough to repopulate the planet and to have that generational turnover. So only through migration are we able to maintain a workforce. And as we all get older, we're not paying into pensions anymore. We're trying to take money out of them. We need a replenishment of the workforce. So in one sense, it's in our self-interest to make immigration work because those are the folks who will pay for the system 20 years from now. So I'm giving you sort of a roundabout answer. But, and again, the other thing is I used to work for government. It is amazing how long people will wait patiently in their home country for a visa if they know there is a chance they will actually get it and be allowed to move legally. The problem is that our immigration systems in Canada, the United States, the European Union, Australia, have become so mismanaged over the years and so inefficient that if I'm 21 years old in Central America and I try to go through the legal channel to get to the United States, I'll be 50 before I actually qualify. So what's the point? If I'm going to go, I'm going to have to go clandestinely. And of course, what that means is I fall into the hands of organized crime because they're the ones who benefit from this system, right? They're the ones who smuggle the people, drugs, exotic pets, they'll smuggle whatever, right? And they prosper in this system. So again, the more legal pathways we can give people to move, whether it's for climate reasons or political strife or others, if the system works better when we invest in a system that works better, if that makes any sense to circle around on myself. Sorry, I'm going on again. Just feel free, Dean, just to go. Stop talking.
I think our goal was to trigger good commentary on your part. So we've accomplished that. I think we're at the point though where we want to thank you for your presentation and your responses to these questions, and then move to talking a bit about what's upcoming on our schedule of webinars. And I believe Joan, did you have any final comments you wanted to make before we hand it off to Andrew to talk about the next session?
Thanks, Dean. I just want to add my voice of thanks, Robert, for a wonderful presentation and a great question and answer session. I've really enjoyed listening to all your answers. And you keep saying that they're long answers, to questions, but really it's giving us a lot of wonderful information. So thank you so much for your time and your generosity in sharing with us today.
Well, it was my pleasure. And I thank you all for taking time out of your Sunday to listen to me ramble on. I will jump off the call just so that you folks can talk amongst yourselves and so on and do whatever business that you do need to attend to. But thanks very much for having me. And, if anybody wants to follow up, just get in touch with Joan and I'm sure she'll forward information along to me. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye
And
now.
over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. On Sunday, the 5th of May, we will hear from Dr. Ruth Valerio. Dr. Ruth is an environmentalist, theologian, social activist, and author of several books, including Alice for Lifestyle and the children's book, Planet Protectors, 52 Ways to Look After God's World. Dr. Ruth Valerio is the director of Tear Fund, a UK-based charity that partners with churches in over 50 countries and to end extreme poverty, respond to disasters and the effects of climate change. Ruth has a particular interest in environmental issues and longs to see the culture of the church change so that caring for God's earth becomes an integral part of church life rather than just an optional extra. On May the 5th, Dr. Ruth will take the theme, Live Simply so Others Can Simply Live, and will focus on the personal choices we can make in addressing the climate crisis. We are all caught in the cycle of buying more and throwing away, and we know we need to simplify our lives. I'm looking forward to finding out how we can make these necessary changes a reality. I hope you can join us.
And before May 5th, we have one other rather special event. It's not our typical webinar. It's in fact a screening of a film, one of a series of 4 films produced by one of our earlier presenters and her husband. Phoebe Bernard, you may recall, I think it's been a couple of years ago, was an early presenter in our series. And she helped us connect our hearts to the beauty and the wonder of our biosphere in all its diversity and its interconnectedness. She's a world-class environmentalist and an environmental scientist, and she's active in many organizations addressing our climate emergency and as a founder of some. Her husband, John Bowie, is a documentary film and TV producer, and Phoebe and John are producing a documentary series called The Climate Restorers. And we're screening the first part of that series on April 21st at 2 p.m. at our regular time, 2 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, both for our enjoyment and education, but also to help fundraise for the production of the remaining parts. Part 1 is titled The Only Way to Predict the Future is to Create It. And it's going to focus on, in particular, the immediate sprint to deal with the challenges of methane, which, as you may know, is 20 times more damaging to our climate in the short run before it finally dissipates into its component parts than is carbon dioxide. Although carbon dioxide, of course, hangs around for much, much longer. But this film, which I've seen, about an hour long, has a wide variety of perspectives on both the need for climate restoration and why emissions reductions aren't enough, and how much marine and methane hotspots, for example, by thawing permafrost and other sources, are creating havoc in our climate. So I'd encourage you to come to that episode as well. It is, again, not a normal webinar session, but a film opportunity that we're really fortunate to be able to have a special screening for. And that comes on April 21st, again, before Ruth Valerio's May 5th presentation. And then, Lori, do you want to just touch on the, for those who might be interested in traveling to or live close by our Sandwich Island campground, the retreat that you're holding, you're helping to create, called What Is Enough?
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to also just say, bring friends to the Climate Restorers film screening and have people register with Rod to get the Zoom link directly if they need to. Think about it for your communities. It's a really amazing opportunity to have a professional, private screening of a professional grade film from someone so remarkable. So the What Is Enough retreat follows up. It's just going to be asking this question about our lifestyles that we've talked about today, and that Ruth Valerio will be really focusing on May and the webinar. So those of you who have more access on the West Coast, Sandwich Island, if you don't know, is about an hour and a half north of the Seattle airport and about an hour, I think, south of the Canadian border. We are offering a retreat from May 30th, which actually begins on Thursday night. Several people from this climate team, Susie and Dean, are going to be doing a session on what is enough relative to climate change. I'm going to be looking at the world's spiritual traditions for understanding of the practice of voluntary simplicity. And we are going to have guests from World Accord, Isabel Hatchett, as doing some work on how this intersection between environmental and social justice really makes a difference. When we ask ourselves the question, what is enough, we make space for others to thrive. So you're very welcome, but I just would like to put this up as a chance for those, particularly in the Pacific Northwest and along the West Coast and inland Mission Center, that have easier access to the campgrounds, but anybody's welcome, to make sure you have this link if you're interested in joining us, so we can actually be talking in person about some of these questions. How do we share lifestyle? So that's it.
Well, that brings us to the end of our activities for today. So I want to thank everyone for joining with us and staying with us and struggling with us through how we're going to respond to the climate crisis. And we'll stop the recording now, and feel free to unmute yourselves and chat, say goodbye, and we hope to see you again soon.